You're an embarrassment in that apron. Marisol, take it off and get out of my sight." The words cracked across the ballroom like a whip, and 300 guests in silk and tuxedos turned to watch a woman the size of 2 brides fold in on herself in front of a 7-tier wedding cake she had spent 11 days building by hand. Marisol Vega did not cry. She had promised herself years ago that she would never again cry in front of people who wanted to see her break. And so she stood very still in the center of the Ashford Grand Ballroom. Flour still dusted along her wrist, and let Chef Renata Cross's voice fill the silence. Her own refused to. "This," Renata said, gesturing at the collapsed sugar rose that had slid off the top tier 20 minutes before the bride's grand entrance, "is what happens when I let the fat girl near anything delicate." A ripple of laughter, uncomfortable but real, moved through the crowd standing near the dessert table. Somewhere behind her, one of the junior pastry assistants actually smirked. Marisol's hands, the same hands that had piped 4,000 identical sugar pearls onto that cake over the course of a week, curled at her sides. She thought of the 11 nights she'd stayed until 2 a.m., perfecting the isomalt sale that Renata had personally taken credit for in the client consultation. She thought of the recipe notebook in her bag, filled with a decade of formulas that Bellamy Events Catering had built half its 5-star reputation on. Formulas nobody in that room except her actually understood. None of it mattered right now. Right now, she was simply the largest, clumsiest, most visible target in a room built entirely on the appearance of perfection. "I didn't touch the top tier after transport," Marisol said quietly. The rose cracked because the delivery van's refrigeration failed for 40 minutes on the Van Wyck. "I logged it. I texted you the temperature reading at 347. Are you calling me a liar in front of my clients?" Renata's voice rose another register. Theatrical. Aimed less at Marisol than at the small cluster of Ashford family members hovering nearby, anxious about their daughter's wedding cake. "Get your things. You're done. I should have let you go 2 years ago." There it was. The sentence Marisol had been bracing for since the day she'd walked into this kitchen, fresh out of culinary school. 22 years old and certain that talent alone would eventually be enough. It hadn't been. Talent had never once, in 10 years, been enough to outweigh a body that didn't fit the glossy Instagram grid of Bellamy Events. A company that sold champagne-colored fantasies and needed its visible staff to look like they belonged inside one. She untied her apron. Her fingers didn't shake, which surprised her. She folded it in half, then in half again, the way her grandmother had taught her to fold linen, and set it on the edge of the dessert table beside the cake she would never see finished. That was when she noticed him. He was standing near the back wall, half in shadow beside a floral column of white hydrangeas, a glass of untouched scotch in one hand. And he was not looking at the collapsed sugar rose or the humiliated woman being fired in front of 200 people. He was looking directly at Marisol, and had been, she realized with a small jolt, since before Renata had even opened her mouth. He was tall in the specific, unhurried way of men who had never once needed to make themselves bigger to be noticed. Dark hair cut close, a black suit that fit him with the precision of something tailored rather than bought, and a stillness to him that made the noise of the ballroom seem to curve around him instead of touching him. His jaw was sharp, his mouth set in something that wasn't quite disapproval and wasn't quite amusement. His eyes, when they held hers, were a pale, unsettling gray, like weather about to turn. Marisol had no idea who he was. She only knew that of everyone in that ballroom who had watched her get destroyed in under 90 seconds, he was the only one who looked genuinely, dangerously angry about it. She looked away first. She had a box of knives to pack and a life to figure out how to rebuild. And she didn't have room in her chest for the strange, electric weight of a stranger's attention. She gathered her knife roll, her notebook, the small tin of vanilla beans she'd brought from home because Bellamy's supplier never sourced Tahitian, and she walked out through the service corridor with her spine straight and her eyes burning and her whole decade unraveling behind her. She did not see the man in the black suit set down his scotch, untouched, and murmur 2 words to the security guard at the door. She did not see him watch the service exit until it closed. She did not know, yet, that his name was Dante Marchetti, that he owned the shipping company that supplied half the flowers, vine, and Sicilian marble in that ballroom, that the Ashford wedding was a business front for a debt negotiation he'd flown in from Palermo to personally oversee, and that in 10 years of sitting through events exactly like this one, he had never once cared what happened to the help until tonight. The apartment Marisol came home to that night was small, the radiator clanking. A stack of unpaid bills fanned across the kitchen counter like a losing hand of cards. She sat on the floor with her back against the refrigerator and ate cold leftover rice straight from the container and did not cry. Because crying required a kind of hope that something better was coming. And right now she didn't have any. 10 years. 10 years of 6 a.m. starts and midnight finishes. Of teaching herself French pastry technique from library books, because culinary school hadn't covered half of what high-end catering actually required. Of quietly correcting Renata's costing errors so the company didn't hemorrhage money on underpriced weddings. Of building a private, meticulous, encrypted spreadsheet that tracked every invoice, every vendor, kickback, every irregularity she'd noticed over the years, because someone raised by an accountant father learns early that numbers don't lie, even when people do. She had never told anyone about that spreadsheet. She'd built it as a private insurance policy, a habit from childhood, the same instinct that made her document everything, timestamp everything. Because in a world that never believed her word against someone prettier or thinner or louder, only evidence had ever protected her. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if that instinct had been less about protecting a job she no longer had, and more about something she hadn't let herself think about yet. Her phone buzzed at 11:40. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something exhaustion. Recklessness. The particular fatalism of a woman who had already lost the worst thing she thought she could lose that day made her pick up. Miss Vega. A man's voice. Low. Faintly accented. Entirely unhurried. As if he had all the time in the world and intended to spend some of it on her. My name is Salvatore. I work for Mr. Marchetti. He would like to speak with you tomorrow morning. At your convenience. Marisol frowned at the ceiling. I don't know a Mr. Marchetti. You will, Salvatore said, and there was something almost like amusement in it. He was at the Ashford event tonight. He'd like to discuss the cake. There is no cake, Marisol said. Flat? I got fired in front of 300 people over a cake that broke because of a refrigeration failure that was not my fault. So unless Mr. Marchetti wants to hire me to cry about it professionally, I don't think we have much to discuss. A pause. Then, quieter, he'd like to discuss the job he's offering you instead. Marisol sat up straighter against the refrigerator. "Den Salvatore said, and gave her an address on a private pier in the East River that made her stomach drop when she looked it up afterward. Because it belonged to Marchetti Import and Maritime, a company whose name she had definitely heard whispered once or twice, in kitchens that suddenly went quiet when certain topics came up. She should have said no. She thought about saying no for approximately 4 hours. Lying awake, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that looked like the coastline of a country she'd never visit. But she had $1,100 in savings. A decade of expertise nobody in the industry would touch now that Renata would surely blacklist her. And a stubborn, quiet fury that had been building under her ribs for 10 years and had nowhere left to go. At 10 the next morning, in a plain gray dress, because it was the only professional thing she owned that didn't have flour permanently ground into the seams, Marisol walked onto a private pier, lined with shipping containers, stamped in 6 languages, and found Dante Marchetti standing at the end of it, watching the water, his hands in his pockets, looking like he belonged to the skyline behind him. "Miss Vega?" He turned. Up close. The gray of his eyes was even more unsettling. Pale and direct. The kind of eyes that didn't perform politeness because they had never needed to. "Thank you for coming. Your man made it sound like I didn't have much choice." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "You always have a choice. I simply try to make the correct one more appealing than the alternative." He gestured toward a small dockside office. Glass-walled, warm light spilling out onto the gray morning. "Coffee. Then we'll talk business." Inside, on a steel table, sat a single slice of dark chocolate and blood orange tart. The exact recipe Marisol had developed for the Ashford consultation weeks earlier, a recipe Renata had presented to the clients as her own. The way she presented everything Marisol made as her own. "You made this," Dante said. It wasn't a question. Marisol's jaw tightened. "How do you have that? I had a slice at the tasting 3 weeks ago." He watched her with an attention that felt like being studied by someone reading a language most people couldn't. "I've eaten in 40 countries. Miss Vega. Michelin kitchens. My grandmother's kitchen in Palermo. Everything between. I remember maybe 3 desserts in my life, the way I remember this one." He nodded at the plate. "I spent 3 weeks finding out who actually made it. Because the woman who took credit for it in the consultation could not tell my associate what varietal of orange was used when he asked her directly." Marisol said nothing. Her pulse had picked up in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I don't care about cake. Miss Vega." Dante's voice dropped. Quieter. More precise. "I care about people who are exceptional at what they do and get treated as if they are disposable. It offends me. Professionally, and..." Apparently a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face personally. "As of last night. What do you want from me? I own a controlling interest in 3 restaurant groups and a hotel chain across 4 states. Every one of them has a pastry program that is, frankly, mediocre." He slid a folder across the table. Inside financial projections, property blueprints. A brand concept sketched out in a designer's careful hand. The words House of Vega across the top. "I want to build something around you. Full creative control. Equity. Not a salary. Your name on the door." Marisol stared at the folder for a long moment before she trusted her voice. "Why would you do this for someone you met yesterday?" "Because I watched a room full of powerful, Well-dressed people applaud, while a woman with more talent than everyone in it combined was humiliated for the shape of her body. Dante said, and something dangerous moved behind his calm. And because in my experience, Miss Vega, the people the world underestimates, the longest tend to become the most formidable, once someone finally hands them the resources to prove it. A pause. I intend to be the one who hands them to you. She should have taken more time. She should have run the numbers, consulted a lawyer, done anything other than what she actually did, which was pick up the pen resting on the folder and sign her name beneath his. Because for the first time in 10 years, someone had looked directly at her and called her formidable instead of large, talented instead of difficult, and something in her chest that had been clenched shut since she was 19 years old finally, quietly, came loose. The weeks that followed moved at a speed that left her dizzy. A test kitchen on Chelsea's western edge, all steel and glass and better ovens than she'd ever touched. A small, ferociously competent team assembled, seemingly overnight a chocolatier poached from Lyon, a baker who'd trained in Vienna, a general manager who called Dante Sir and Marisol Chef with the same unblinking respect. Dante himself appeared at odd hours, never intrusive, always watching, tasting whatever she put in front of him with the same total focus he'd given that first slice of tart. And slowly, without either of them naming it, those visits stopped being about business. It was, in fact, precisely the contradiction in her that seemed to fascinate him most. In the test kitchen, Marisol could be almost comically awkward. She knocked over a tray of proofed dough her first week and apologized to it like it had feelings. Tripped over her own knife roll at least once a shift. Blushed and stammered through every compliment a food critic tried to pay her in person, but hand her a balance sheet, a supplier contract in French, or a kitchen in genuine crisis. And something in her transformed, instantly spine straight, voice flat and certain, hands moving with a precision that made the Vienna-trained baker mutter, the first week, that he'd never seen anyone read a walk-in inventory sheet like a battle map. She spoke fluent French from a childhood spent visiting her mother's family outside Lyon. Could recalculate a recipe's costing to the cent faster than the general manager's spreadsheet software, and once corrected a Michelin inspector's understanding of classical French technique so calmly and thoroughly that the man had asked, only half joking, whether she'd consider teaching a masterclass. It was, Dante told her once, watching her dismantle a supplier's inflated invoice line by line with the same hands that had just fumbled a whisk onto the floor. The most interesting thing about you, and I include the cooking. He told her things in fragments, the way men who guarded everything learned to give away only what they trusted a person to carry safely, that his mother had died young, that his father had built the Marchetti shipping empire out of nothing but a fishing boat and a willingness to be feared, and that Dante had spent his whole life inheriting both the empire and the fear, without ever being asked whether he wanted either, that he did not, as a rule, trust easily, and that trusting her had happened faster than anything in his adult life, which unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She told him about her father, an accountant who'd taught her to read a balance sheet before she could read a novel, and how that skill had turned into a habit of documenting everything because nobody had ever simply taken her word for anything. She told him about 10 years of being told she was too big for the front of house, too big for photographs, talented enough to be useful and never talented enough, apparently, to be seen. There was a night, weeks before the lawsuit ever arrived, that Marisol would return to often in memory the two of them alone on the test kitchen's back stairwell after midnight. The rest of the building dark, sharing a bottle of wine directly from the neck because neither of them could be bothered finding glasses. Dante had loosened his tie, an almost unbearably rare sight, and was watching her with the unguarded attention he usually reserved only for negotiations he considered dangerous. "Ask me something," she'd said, emboldened by the wine and the dark and the strange safety of being unseen by anyone but him. Something real, not business. He'd considered it for a long moment. Why cooking? You have the mind for finance. You could have made a great deal more money doing something considerably less exhausting. Because numbers tell you what happened, she'd said slowly, turning the bottle in her hands. Food tells you someone cared. My father taught me to read a ledger. My grandmother taught me that a ledger only ever matters because of what it lets you build with it. I wanted to build something people could taste. She'd glanced sideways at him. Your turn. Why shipping? When you clearly hate half the men you have to negotiate with, because my father built it with his hands out of nothing. And it is the only inheritance he ever gave me that I actually respect. Dante had said, quiet, honest in a way she suspected very few people ever got from him. Everything else he left me. I am still deciding whether to keep. He'd looked at her then. In the near dark, wine loosened and unguarded, and something had passed between them that neither of them named yet, though both of them understood, with total clarity, exactly what it was. You will be seen now, Dante said. The night House of Vega's soft opening finally arrived. Standing behind her in the kitchen doorway, as the first plates went out to a room full of critics and food editors who had no idea yet what they were about to taste. I intend to make certain of it. The opening was not perfect. A walk-in freezer's compressor failed an hour before service. A pastry case arrived, cracked. Marisol nearly had a panic attack in the walk-in pantry at 6:15, but by the time the last course went out, the room was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something extraordinary has happened in it. Reviews. When they came, used words nobody had ever used about her work before. Masterful. Transformative. A singular voice. For the first time. Her name not Bellamy's. Not Renata's sat at the top of everyone. Word travels fast in an industry built on gossip disguised as networking. And it reached Renata Cross within days that the woman she'd fired in front of 300 wedding guests now had her name above the door of the restaurant. Every food critic in Manhattan was suddenly desperate to review Bellamy Events bookings. Already thinning, after 2 seasons of quietly declining quality, nobody but Marisol had ever noticed how to fix. Began to collapse outright. Once clients realized the difference between the woman who'd built the menu and the woman who'd merely presented it. Renata did not take the humiliation gracefully. The story hit the industry, blogs first, an anonymous tip. Suspiciously well-timed. Claiming that Marisol Vega had left Bellamy Events with proprietary recipes and client contact lists. That House of Vega's entire opening menu was, in fact, stolen intellectual property Bellamy had spent years developing. Within 48 hours, a formal cease and desist letter arrived, followed within a week by an actual lawsuit, naming Marisol personally and threatening an injunction against House of Vega's continued operation. Marisol read the filing standing in her own kitchen at midnight, hands shaking for the first time since the night she'd been fired. Because this wasn't humiliation anymore. This was an attempt to take away the one thing in her life that had ever truly belonged to her. They can't win this, Dante said when she called him, his voice gone flat and dangerously calm in a way she'd learned meant he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever was frightening her. But they can hurt us while they try. That's the point of a suit like this, not to win. To bleed you slow. What if they succeed? They won't. A pauser. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter. Rougher. Marisol. You survived 10 years of that woman taking credit for your work before you ever met me. You survived being told you were too much and not enough in the same breath. A lawsuit built on a lie is not the thing that breaks you. I refuse to allow it to be. 2 nights before the lawsuit's first hearing, Marisol's phone lit up with a text from a number she didn't recognize. No greeting. No name. Just a photograph. And beneath it, 4 words, "We know what you did." The photograph had been taken years ago. Long before Bellamy. Long before Dante Marisol at 19. Sitting alone on a curb outside a diner where she'd worked double shifts through culinary school. Mascara streaked down her face after a customer had loudly informed the manager that someone that size shouldn't be handling food in front of paying guests. Seeing it now. Resurrected and weaponized. Made something cold drop through her stomach. Because whoever had sent it wasn't threatening to expose a secret. They were threatening to make her that girl again. When she told Dante the next morning, his stillness went all the way through him. The particular quiet she'd learned was far more dangerous than shouting. It took his people 4 days to trace the number to a burner phone, and 4 more to connect it to a former Bellamy coordinator who'd been quietly let go years earlier and had simply kept the photo out of spite. Waiting for a moment cruel enough to use it, Dante's lawyers added the harassment to the countersuit within the hour. The night before the industry's Vanguard Awards, Dante sent a car instead of calling, and inside it hung a single garment bag with a note in his sharp, economical handwriting: "Wear whatever makes you feel like yourself. This is only in case you'd like an option." Inside was a floor-length gown in deep emerald silk, cut with the kind of expert tailoring that didn't try to minimize her. It simply fit. Beautifully. The fabric settling over her the way it had been built around the actual shape of her body, rather than the shape the industry had spent 10 years telling her to apologize for. She stood in front of her mirror a long time before putting it on, thinking of every event she'd once been quietly told to sit out. Then she zipped the dress, swept her hair back the way she liked it and had never worn in public, and looked at herself, really looked, and did not see anything that needed fixing. When she walked into the lobby of Dante's building, whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere behind his teeth. "Say something," she said, half laughing. "I'm choosing my words." He said, "Low," because the first 4 that came to mind were not appropriate for a lobby. He offered his arm. "You look like exactly who you are. Marisol. Formidable." His voice dropped further. "And devastating. Both." At once, the culinary industry's annual Vanguard Awards drew every major food journalist, a restaurateur, and power broker in the city into one ballroom, and House of Vega had just been nominated for Restaurant of the Year in its first year of operation. Renata Cross was there too, seated near the front. Right up until the moment the presenter opened the envelope and Renata stood, uninvited, microphone already in her hand, and began repeating every accusation from the lawsuit in front of the entire room. Then Dante stood. He didn't raise his voice, he never needed to. He simply walked to the front and asked, with total calm, for the house screen to display what he'd prepared for, exactly this possibility. 31 seconds of footage showing Renata's own hand disabling the delivery van's refrigeration monitor the night before the Ashford wedding. time-stamped recipe files, proving 6 years of independent development, and a forensic summary of Bellamy's finances cross-referenced against the private spreadsheet Marisol had quietly kept for years. By the time the screen went dark, Renata had no microphone left in her hand and nowhere left in the room to look. Marisol Vega built everything she has through talent, disciplina, and 10 years of being underestimated by people who should have known better. Dante said into the silence, "Anyone still choosing to say otherwise after tonight is simply lying." The applause was not polite. House of Vega won Restaurant of the Year 11 minutes later. And when Marisol reached the microphone, the room went silent to listen to her, the way it had once gone silent to watch her be destroyed. For 10 years, I believed if I worked hard enough, eventually someone would notice. She said, "I was wrong. What actually changes things is one person deciding to see you clearly and refusing to look away no matter how loud the room gets. I got that. Finally. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life pretending I don't know how rare it is." Later, on the terrace of Dante's penthouse, the city spread gold and endless beneath them. Marisol felt him come to stand behind her. Close, but not quite touching, patient. Deliberate. Giving her the choice to close the last distance herself. "Do you know what I thought?" he said quietly, near her ear. "The first time I tasted what you made, I thought whoever made this understands exactly how much care something needs before it becomes worth remembering." His hand settled at the small of her back. "I think about you the same way now." She turned to face him. "That's a strange way to tell a woman you're falling for her." "Mr. Marchetti, I've never claimed to be simple." His hand rose to her jaw. "I am, for what it's worth, honest. I'm not interested in simple. Marisol, I'm interested in you." When he kissed her, it was unhurried, deliberate, as though he'd already decided this was permanent. Below them, the same city that had watched her humiliated 3 months earlier was utterly unaware that the woman it once dismissed was standing above it all. Finally, entirely seen. "There will be more of them," she said quietly, meaning Renata, meaning the industry, meaning every voice that had decided her worth before she opened her mouth. "Let them try," Dante said, something like a real smile reaching his eyes. "I've developed a considerable appetite for proving people like that wrong." He drew her closer, "Starting tonight. And for as long as you'll let me." She didn't answer with words. Some things only needed to be understood quietly. Completely. The way the best recipes never required explaining. Only tasting. Only trusting that what had been built, carefully and honestly, over time, was exactly as strong as it looked.